just to say what I'm really interested in is in ways of thinking. How are we thinking in what we are doing? And particularly, what are we taking for granted? What are we assuming is reality when it may not be reality, whatever that is. So it's the things that we just take for granted and think are not even worth questioning. Over the lunch table, for example, I was talking about a kind of deep-seated belief that we have nowadays that our mind is inside us somehow. And it's like, it seems perfectly obvious, of course. We talk in the way of what's in my mind and this kind of thing. Well, that's the kind of idea that I'm getting at. So sort of very basic ideas that are worth stopping for a bit and questioning. Now, why would I want to do that? Well, because it's got very practical implications. How we think is intimately tied up with what we're doing. And frequently, when we're surprised at what happens when we're doing something, it's because of these implicit, tacit, taken for granted ways of thinking, which are blinding us to some occurrences, some things that are going on, and focusing our attention on other things that are going on. And we particularly do this, I think, when we're very busy, when we're caught up in a very hectic round of activity in the organizations that we work in. So perhaps then I can tell you a little bit about, say, some of the organizations I've been involved in as a manager or consultant or whatever, and then how I came afterwards to reflect upon what I was doing. So I'll take one example to start off with, which is now quite an old one, and that's some years ago now. I've been back in universities for the past 15 odd years, and before that I worked briefly for about a year in an investment house in the City of London as an investment strategist, and before that, for a period of something like 15 years, I worked for a large British construction company that in those days used to operate internationally, had businesses all around the world, and at the time was one of the probably the top 3 UK international construction companies. My role there, what I ended up there as, was the manager director of the corporate planning department, the corporate strategy function that reported to the board. And when I then found my way back again into university life, the only thing I could think of to do was to teach strategic management. So I then found myself in the position of having to read the textbooks on strategic management, which I hadn't been reading while I was a strategic manager, in order to be able to say something when these classes turned up. And that got me thinking about what had actually been going on while I was working for this construction company, which was called John Laing. What were we actually doing? What was I doing as the corporate planning manager? And then I began really to notice some of what had been going on. So let's go back then, now quite a long time ago, to one period in which every year, which many companies still do, every year we would prepare the budget for the next year, the annual plan, and at the same time we'd go through a whole procedure for preparing the 5-year strategic plan. Now, let's take one example of this. In one particular period, we had a whole lot of discussions, people, the heads, the directors of, managing directors of the subsidiary companies and the members of the board, and we talked about what's going to be the strategy for the next 5 years, what are we going to do. And we said things like, if I can remember, So we said we wanted to expand our activities in overseas countries. So we picked a number of new countries that we'd go into. For example, Venezuela was one of them. We'd expand our activities in the Middle East. We'd invest money and expand the subsidiary company we had in Spain, and so on and so on. Now that's one thing we were going to do. We were also going to invest quite a lot of money in the building products companies that we owned. We owned a company that produced concrete blocks, for example. We were going to put a lot of money in let that grow. What else? We were also going to diversify to some extent because we didn't operate in the market for process engineering. That's the design and managing the construction of large chemical plants, that kind of thing. So we would acquire a business that could do that kind of thing. And we made a number of other statements. Well, 5 years passed, and then of course we did what I think a number of companies still do, and that's we prepared forecasts of consequences of these intentions over the next 5 years. And what we produced was a very attractive position at the end of 5 years' time, in which we were earning a lot of profit. There would be a large capital inflow, and so on. 5 years passed, and in looking back at what we had actually done, we had more or less done what we said we would do. We had gone overseas. We had bought a process engineer, an Italian process engineer. We had built new plants to produce various building products, and we acquired more building products companies, and so on and so on. Unfortunately, however, the forecasts turned out to be completely different to the actual turned out to be completely different to what we forecast. So instead of earning large profits and having huge cash inflows, in fact, we were making a loss, which we managed to conceal from the stock exchange, because of course companies have two sets of accounts in Britain. They have two sets of accounts. One is the management account, which is sort of as near as you can get to, we think, to what might actually be happening. Except, of course, all the subsidiary companies are also trying to conceal from the holding company how things might not be going quite as well as we hoped. So even that's not quite sure. But then when it comes to publishing the financial accounts, which go to the stock market and banks and all that kind of thing, you can make all sorts of other maneuvers which are perfectly legal, but have the effect of concealing just how bad the situation is for this year. Of course, we then are making it worse for next year, because eventually we're going to have to disclose to the public what's. So it's a matter of moving things around the time period. Anyway, even the financial accounts showed we weren't making any profit at all, and you can't conceal the cash flow because that's factual. The money's either coming in or it's going out. And there was a huge cash flow outflow. Complete opposite then of what we forecast would happen as a result of what we did. Now then, how you think about things comes in then when we get together, those who know what's going on, rather anxiously, because it even looks like it's not impossible that we'll go bankrupt. But you don't tell many people about that, of course. So we get together and we try and work out, well, what on earth's happened here? What's gone wrong? And in thinking about it afterwards, and in other situations, three things strike me about how we were thinking about what had gone wrong. First of all, we thought, what has gone wrong? So that's immediately a taken for granted assumption that things could have gone right. As if it's not natural that things are going to periodically go not quite what we wanted them to be. But how then do we explain what's happened? Well, the first kind of explanation or feeling is, and the first justification for what had happened is things like, well, we couldn't have known that the markets would turn out to be less buoyant than we hoped they'd be. In other words, the explanation is ignorance. We were ignorant. And the response to being ignorant is to say, well, we better try to inform ourselves better this time so that this doesn't happen to us again. Note, we're assuming that it is possible for us to realize our global, overall, collective intention over long periods of time. We took that for granted. Competent people ought to be able to get together, and well-informed people ought to be able to get together and form an intention about what they're going to do for 5 years or so, and if we're